Next up, we have the illustrious PhD candidate, Elsa Kania, who's going to give up her presentation on Babylon 5. Elsa, the floor is yours.
All right. Good evening. Hope you all are well, healthy, and getting vaccinated these days. And I'm excited to have the chance here at NavyCon to share a couple of initial reflections on a show that I started watching during the pandemic and against the backdrop of a lot of the turbulence in politics and civil military relations over the past year or so. So I'm a new fan of the show, and I've found it relevant and thought-provoking as a means to think through current dilemmas and challenges. So I won't quite manage to do justice to the plot in all its complexity or to the different nuances of the geopolitics, or perhaps we should say astropolitics, of the world of Babylon 5, but I will try to talk through a couple of the core dilemmas faced by leaders in Babylon 5, and especially of the commanders of the station, as they find the complexity and duality of their role transcend the norms of civil military relations and the norms of military professionalism in which they had initially been inculcated as officers of Earth Force. So again, Babylon 5, imagining a future of which the Earth Alliance has recently won or reached a stalemate and after conflict with the Minbari, and Babylon 5 was created as in the hope of peace, as a space for diplomacy, for engagement among different alien civilizations, and operated by Earth Alliance through the command of Earth Force, but in partnership with and with extensive engagement with alien governments as well. And you see across these three commanders of Babylon 5, we see in the course of the show quite different outlooks on leadership and military professionalism as they grapple with the fraught circumstances in which they find themselves against the backdrop of crises in Earth politics, as well as the Shadow War, which I won't quite discuss in the detail it would merit, but would definitely recommend those who have not seen the show to check it out going forward. But in each of these officers serves as the station commander and essentially military governor, but is still also subject to the chain of command of Earth Force through the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and has to navigate trying the conflicting loyalties and political imperatives that come with these roles against the backdrop of a situation in which governance on Earth is descending into totalitarianism. And after the explosion of Earth Force One, initially believed to be an accident, had killed the then president of the Earth Alliance, who had been supportive of the Babylon 5 project and encouraging of friendly relations between Earth and alien governments. The Babylon 5 team sees the rise to power of his former vice president, then President Clark, who declares an Earth-first approach and much more of a xenophobic outlook on the universe. And the Babylon 5 team gradually discovers the conspiracy behind that initial accident, which was in fact an assassination engineered by President Clark with alien influence in the process, and Clark proceeds to declare martial law, dissolve the Earth Senate, and created the Night Watch, a paramilitary organization that is responsible for countering subversion. So at this point, the constitution of the Earth Alliance has been violated by every means imaginable, and Babylon 5 team is in the difficult position of still being subject to the authority of Earth, even as they watch with dismay as the abuses of civil liberties and human rights by Clark, who has essentially seized power as an autocrat at this point in the show, these dynamics continue to worsen. And it was fascinating to see across the episodes and against the backdrop of various other happenings, the extent to which questions of appropriate respect for the chain of command become a major plot point and dilemma for Babylon 5's leadership. And at this point, Captain Sheridan is in the position of trying to receiving orders from Earth to accept the imposition of martial law on the station at the direction of the political office, and he ultimately concludes or realizes that he can avoid, at least in the meantime, the question of imposition of martial law, because that order has come while from the president has not come through the proper chain of command with the Joint Chiefs, but rather the political office, and therefore he has the right and indeed the obligation to disregard it, and has to walk a balance between respecting Earth's authority and the commands he receives from Earth Force, but also trying to resist to the extent possible, even as that space continues to close. And in parallel, and perhaps by contrast, other Earth Force officers, including General Haig of the then Joint Chairman of the Joint Chief, had actually attempted to undertake a coup in response to Clark's declaration of martial law, and which sparked a series of defections within Earth Force. And as Clark's tyranny worsened, including attacks on Earth's colony on Mars, which involved bombing of civilian targets, many within Earth Force faced the fraught choices and decision in those circumstances of whether to obey those orders or whether to defect and refuse to obey and thereby be branded as traitors. And as this show continues, things start to escalate to a point where, after even worse attacks on civilian targets, and including on refugees and mass casualties, Captain John Sheridan, in his capacity as military governor of Babylon 5, declares that the station will follow other Earth colonies and succeed from Earth. And in response to these violations of the Constitution, abrogation of the appropriate civilian authorities, and again, the attacks on civilian targets, and that contravene the ethics and spirit of the Earth Alliance, and deaths of innocent, he justifies this step in terms of a moral imperative and declares Babylon 5's independence. And this is a rather remarkable transition and moment of disruption, and Babylon 5 from that moment forward becomes a source of resistance and a center of those who are opposing tyranny on Earth, as these politics and the worsening of the situation within the Earth Alliance continues across seasons to come, and eventually Babylon 5 becomes at the center of an alliance intended to liberate Earth, with support from other defectors from Earth Force as well as alien governments. And this culminates in a climactic battle of campaign for the liberation of Earth, and along the way a series of confrontations with fellow Earth Force officers and appeals to them to reject Clark's authority to disobey orders that they should know are illegal. And while ultimately, I'll try to avoid spoilers as best I can in the course of the conversation, ultimately, against the backdrop of very dire circumstances, this campaign of liberation succeeds. President Clark commits suicide after last-ditch attempt at a scorched earth strategy, and Captain Sheridan has been successful, and yet ultimately surrenders to Earth Force and is later forced to resign his commission as a condition for receiving amnesty from the Earth Senate, and ultimately the verdict on his behavior from the then acting president of the Earth Alliance is that he had led an insurrection against his own government. He engaged in mutiny at best, treason at worst, and yet he was right morally, though is politically inconvenient. So his actions continue to be quite controversial within Earth Force, and in the aftermath of the liberation of Earth and the restoration of civilian authorities, he takes on a new role as president of a coalition that follows. But one of the salient dramas and tensions that continues under the commander who succeeds him, Captain Elizabeth Lockley, was that her choice in this role as the new commander and military governor of Babylon 5 is in part because she was among those Earth Force officers who had remained loyal to President Clark, despite his disbanding of the Senate, declaration of martial law, and the known atrocities and attacks on civilians that her fellow officers were directed to undertake, and her precise circumstances, and whether or not she was placed in a situation where she might have been directed to obey legal orders. That there's some ambiguity in the show as to her experience during that time. But I think the clearest moment where there is this tension between competing paradigms of military professionals of what it means to be an Earth Force officer comes in a confrontation between her and another of the Babylon 5 leadership, in which she ultimately violently disagrees with Captain Sheridan's previous actions, and she declares that you can take a stand without destroying your chain of command. And declares it wouldn't have been her place to tear up the Constitution. And trying to take a step back from the drama of Babylon 5 and look at this through the lens of some of our current debates and literatures on civil-military relations and civilian control. While I can't quite do these discussions justice, I'll try to point to some of these outlooks in order to argue why I think Captain Lockley's outlook here and her disagreement with Sheridan's challenging circumstances and the suboptimal decisions he made in that role, why her argument doesn't stand up, and in fact reflects a perhaps dangerous misunderstanding on her part of what her responsibilities and obligations of an Earth Force officer would have been. And again, she articulates very much this norm of objective control, this idea of apolitical professionalism, that as an Earth Force officer, she should be above and beyond politics, irregardless seemingly of what is happening in politics. And as we've seen again in recent scholarship and debates in civil-military relations, including work by Risa Brooks, there are certain paradoxes and contradictions that come with that idea of purely apolitical professionalism, which can in fact be detrimental. And when there are efforts, as happened in the Earth Alliance under President Clark, to politicize the military officers have to be engaged with and cognizant of politics in order to have effective and nonpartisan responses. And again, the demands of the profession demand engagement with politics and an awareness of a sense of the profession beyond a narrowly circumscribed role, and understanding of what an oath and obligation to the Constitution mean in actuality. And her argument that Captain Sheridan, perhaps by her view, ought to have adhered to the chain of command and not torn up the Constitution is inherently contradictory, given that the Constitution on Earth had already been flagrantly violated by President Clark, and with the intervention of the political office into the chain of command, the traditional chain of command was essentially null and void at that point. So those Earth Force officers who continued to obey orders under those circumstances, and those who obeyed illegal orders, such as firing on civilian targets in the indiscriminate bombing of Mars, were both wrong ethically and from the perspective of the norms and expectations of their profession. And again, we've seen recent debates as to how to understand ethics as not just merely involving loyalty that is in questioning, but rather the importance of disobedience, for instance, as Dr. Shanks Karan has argued, and that there is a duty on officers to disobey unlawful orders. So I think in closing, I would say that I think the central drama of Babylon 5 around these questions of civilian control and civil-military relations has a certain resonance with debates we're seeing in our world and given recent events, and questions of what it means to be a military officer and professional, questions of the law of war, ethics when it comes to use of force, and question of understanding of lawful orders, and ultimately the importance of having an oath and loyalty to the Constitution, not a party, a tyrant as was President Clark, or a political office, and the importance, again, I think of the disobedience of unlawful orders, and the understanding of what is required both by law and by ethics, and the distinction between that relative to treason or insurrection. And again, I think these are complex issues that will merit further conversation, and one would hope in the world of Babylon 5 that in light of these events, they would continue to incorporate into their professional military education and debates on civil military relations as a society how to improve their understanding of these core issues of civics, ethics, and these core norms that are essential to any democracy. So I will stop there for now. We'll look forward to questions and continuing the conversation, and very honored to have a chance to join NavyCon and to take part in the panel this evening. Thank you all for your attention.
Outstanding work, Elsa. And I think if there are any network executives that happen to watch this, you've given them a litany of reasons to bring back Babylon 5 to answer all these questions and explore them. So plenty of good fodder there. And I will say, when you, between law of war and lawful orders, or the lawfulness of orders, you're speaking my language. So outstanding work, and thank you very much. I want to invite everyone out there that's watching. Drop your questions that you have for any of these panels, for Elsa, for Matt, for anything that you see, into the Discord server. We're going to bring them on, and at the end of all of these presentations within this panel, we're going to have a combined moderated Q&A session. So get those questions ready. You can go ahead and drop them in. We've got producers that are checking the Discord to pull those over into our stream, and we appreciate all of you watching.